Just let me begin by saying I'm very pleased to be able to be here, to be a part of this series of testimonies. I think it's important to do, and I'm happy that I was able to do it. Since we are here at the time of the Biennale, I think it's worth saying something that is very striking if you go and look in the pavilions and at the work that is on display everywhere in the city. That artists are and have always been, in a way, nomads as well. That artistic intelligence crosses all boundaries of language and nation, and artists themselves have often traveled very widely to find their inspiration and to find their, if you like, their artistic way. I notice also that the pavilions are sometimes mixed up even in nationality. I noticed that the Danish pavilion has a group show, and one of the artists on display there is an American photographer. So the world of art has always understood that these boundaries of nationality and language are unimportant, and that in order to find your direction and your voice as an artist, you often have to look and move, indeed, beyond those boundaries. And I think that's one of the reasons, given how much artists travel, artists in all forms, it's important to come to the support of this group, which is a group who are amongst the oldest travelers in the world. I was thinking as a writer how much of the literature, of the greatest literature of the world, has depended on the phenomenon of traveling and of journeying. I'm thinking of the English writer Robert Byron making his road to Oxiana as one of the first explorations of Central Asia, or of my friend Bruce Chatwin in England traveling along the song lines of the Australian Aborigines, of Richard Burton traveling in the Arab world and coming up with certainly the most eccentric translation of the Arabian Nights, and perhaps one of the most entertaining, certainly the one with the most sexual footnotes. I think about the great Argentinian publisher Victoria Ocampo traveling in India and falling in love with the work of Rabindranath Tagore, and making sure, being determined that that work should be available to readers in Latin America, and having the entire work of Tagore translated very well into Spanish, so the work migrated. And I found, to my great surprise, when I began to travel in Latin America, that writers were constantly telling me of their admiration for this Indian writer whom they called Tagore. But I thought it was astonishing that in Latin America people maybe know more about Tagore than they do in India, and a lot of that has to do with the travel of Victoria Ocampo to India and her falling in love with that artist. The Arabian Nights itself, is a book that has traveled across the world. The stories that we think of as the 1001 Nights most of them originally began in India, long before they were in Arabic. They were Indian folk tales, and they were first collected in a collection written in Persian, which was the court language in India at the time, a collection called Hazar Afsana, which is 1,000 stories. That collection made its way to the West, into the Arab world, and was translated into Arabic, and other stories were added to it, including, of course, the famous framing narrative of Shahrazad, and that became the 1001 Nights. That book has traveled further, and in fact, if you look at one of the great inspirations of Latin American magic realism, it is the influence of the Arabian Nights in that country. So the world of literature has always understood that journeying, migration, nomadism, this is the heart. This is not a peripheral aspect of art. This is very close to the heart of what it is to be an artist. And as a result, I've always been shocked when these groups, who are ancient nomadic groups, have been attacked both in words and actually in deeds violently by different European countries. I have to say, given the results of the recent elections in Italy, that might be a little bit to the benefit of the Roma, since the Prime Minister in Milan was heard to say that if Milan went to the left, that the city would be flooded by Muslims and gypsies. well, I guess the Muslim and Gypsy invasion is underway. and, but I do think it shows that the people of that city demonstrated better sense than their prime minister. And hopefully that is a sign of a change in the climate in this country, because certainly it's a horrifying thing that an entire ethnic group should be stigmatized, both in this country and in France, in fact, and that a kind of ethnic cleansing should be carried out in Western Europe. That term became a rightly abhorrent term when we saw it taking place in Eastern Europe, in former Yugoslavia and elsewhere. And it's just as abhorrent a term when it takes place here. I wanted to just make one more point about the Indian connection. A friend of mine, American writer Isabel Fonseca, some years ago, wrote a very fine study of Roma, a book called Bury Me Standing, which was a great success actually in the United States. And I remember when she was writing the book that she had a lexicon of Roma words. And given that there is this belief in the connection between the Roma and India, she said, would I just look at this vocabulary and see if I understood or recognized any of the words as a way of trying to see if there was this linguistic connection. When I looked at it, I was genuinely astonished, because at least 3/4 of the words were words that I easily recognized as having their exact counterparts in Hindi. And even the ones that were not so exact, you could see that a very small etymological shift had taken place of a kind of B and V kind, so you could very easily see how the word had shifted from one language to the other, but was essentially the same word. Having studied that Roma lexicon, it left me in absolutely no doubt that there is a historical connection between India and the Romani people. That the languages are so close, it is impossible for there to be a doubt in it. That you could, I having read that, thought you could actually go into a community of Roma speaking Hindi, and even though they might not recognize the accent and so on, they would probably recognize a lot of what you were saying. And it really was a shocking and very educational discovery for me. That these ancient journeys may have actually come from the same place as me. One thing I've always believed, and I've written about it a lot, is that we live in what I've called the age of the migrant. This is a time in which, let's say in the last, not even 100 years, the last 50 years, 60 years, when more people have moved across the face of the world than has ever happened in human history before. More people now end up in places which are not the place where they began than has ever happened. And this is now on the scale of millions and millions of people. It's in fact beginning to be, certainly in terms of the great cities of the world, almost more normal for the inhabitants of those cities not to have been born in those cities, to have come to those cities from somewhere else. New York City, for instance, I think 75% of the people who live in New York were born outside New York. Maybe elsewhere in the United States, not necessarily in other countries, but everybody coming to the great cities of the world. The same is true of Bombay, my birthplace. Most of the people who live in Bombay today were born in other parts of India. And so that fact, the fact of migration, of journeying to a place, has in a way defined modern urban life. It is these movers who have shaken and shaped the world we live in. And I have for a long time seen this as a creative force, and in my books I've tried to, for the most part, celebrate it. And I think it's an enriching thing for a culture to be mixed with other cultures, in the same way as it's an impoverishing thing for species to inbreed. To be forced to breed with ideas and ways of life which are not your own, and to create that kind of hybrid world has always seemed to me to be an enriching thing for the place, not only for the people who come to the place, but for the place to which they come. The Satanic Verses was a novel of that kind. It was there was a kind of distraction around that novel, which allowed many of the people who didn't read it to think that it was a novel about something else. But at the heart of that book, it's a book about migration and its consequences. It's a book about what happens to the roots of the self when people, instead of staying in one place, when people instead move. You could say that our traditional idea of the self is that the self is rooted in place, in language, in culture, and in community. And those peoples who are mobile, nomadic, who are footloose, who travel across the world or are driven across the world by necessity, those people traditionally lose all those roots. They find themselves in a place which is strange to them, in a language which is not their own, in a culture which is not their culture, and in a community where nobody knows them. And as a result, it is necessary to find new roots for the self, different ways of being a person, different ways of understanding yourself in the world. And I think that is one of the most interesting phenomena of our time, because it's now no longer an isolated phenomenon, it's a mass phenomenon. This is a thing happening to millions upon millions and millions of us, not just to these small groups who we define and stigmatize because of their journeying. It's a very general phenomenon. I mean, I've always thought I myself would not be possible except in the age of migration. You know, in the absence of airplanes, a person like myself could not exist. Having been born in one country, lived in another, now living in a third, speaking languages from all these different parts of the world, which were just simply given to me by virtue of where I happen to be. That's allowed me to be not just the person, but also the writer that I am. It would not be possible to have written the books I've written were it not for that kind of rather strange, but now, as I say, not so strange life experience. These days, of course, the subject of migration has begun to be a cause of fear, and that people have reacted to migrant communities in their midst, not positively, not seeing them as a source of enrichment, but as seeing them as other, alien, and to be worried about, let's say, to be uncertain about, and to be sometimes fearful about. And that has happened all over the world to many different communities. Today, across Europe, there is a kind of fear-mongering politics which is creating a new xenophobia of the right. And we find ourselves here to talk about, as I say, the oldest travelers of all, who are amongst the most vulnerable to that kind of xenophobia and are facing, in many parts of Europe, brutal treatment. In 1983, I wrote a novel called Shame, which was in part about Pakistan, in part about moving from Pakistan to England. And in it, I talked about what I came to think of as the myth of roots. I just wanted to read you a bit of that. I too, says the narrator, there's an unnamed narrator in the novel who may or may not be the author of the novel. I too know something of this migrant business. I am an emigrant from one country, India, and a newcomer in two. And I have a theory that the resentments we migrants engender may have something to do with our conquest of the force of gravity. We have performed the act of which all men anciently dreamed, the thing for which they envy the birds. That is to say, we have flown. I am comparing gravity with belonging. Both phenomena observably exist. My feet stay on the ground. And I have never been angrier than the day when my father told me he sold our childhood home in Bombay. But neither phenomenon is well understood. We know the force of gravity, but not its origins. And to explain why we become attached to our birthplaces, we pretend that we are trees and speak of roots. Look under your feet. You will not find gnarled growths sprouting through the soles. Roots, I sometimes think, are a conservative myth designed to keep us in our places. What is the worst thing about migrant peoples? It's the emptiness of one's luggage. I'm speaking of invisible suitcases, not the physical, perhaps cardboard variety, containing a few meaning-drained mementos. We have come unstuck from more than land. We have floated upwards from history, from memory, from time. Look under your feet, no roots there. We are not planted things, but mobile creatures. Yet we have become a species that, as I've been saying, defines itself increasingly by place, nation, tribe, and is alarmed by placelessness. And I think there's something here which is about our secret selves that needs to be explored. And I tried to write about it in another novel of mine, a novel called The Ground Beneath Her Feet, which is about a group of characters who in a way come unstuck from the place that they've grown up in and travel across the world. And the narrator of that novel, who's a photographer, sort of reflects on this phenomenon and says, "For a long while, I have believed that in every generation there are a few souls, call them lucky or cursed, who are simply born not belonging, who come into the world semi-detached, if you like, without strong affiliation to family or location or nation or race. That there may even be millions, billions of such souls, as many non-belongers as belongers perhaps, that in some the phenomenon may be as natural a manifestation of human nature as its opposite, but one that has been mostly frustrated throughout human history by lack of opportunity. Not only by that, for those who value stability, who fear transience, uncertainty, change, have erected powerful taboos, a powerful system of stigmas and taboos against rootlessness, that disruptive antisocial force, so that we mostly conform. We pretend to be motivated by loyalties and solidarities we do not really feel. We hide our secret identities beneath the false skin of those identities which bear the belonger's seal of approval. But the truth leaks out in our dreams, alone in our beds, because we are alone at night, even if we do not sleep by ourselves. We soar, we fly, we flee. And in the waking dreams our societies permit, in our myths, our arts, our songs, we celebrate the non-belongers, the different ones, the outlaws, the freaks. What we forbid ourselves, we pay good money to watch in a playhouse or movie theatre, or to read about between the secret covers of a book. Our libraries, our palaces of entertainment tell the truth. The tramp, the assassin, the rebel, the thief, the mutant, the outcast, the delinquent, the devil, the sinner, the traveler, the gangster, the runner, the mask. If we did not recognize in them our least fulfilled needs, we would not invent them over and over again, in every place, in every language, in every time. No sooner did we have ships than we rushed to sea, sailing across oceans in paper boats. No sooner did we have cars than we hit the road. No sooner did we have airplanes than we zoomed to the furthest corners of the globe. Now we yearn for the moon's dark side, the rocky plains of Mars, the rings of Saturn, the interstellar deeps. We send mechanical photographers into orbit or on one-way journeys to the stars, and we weep at the wonders they transmit. We are humbled by the mighty images of far-off galaxies standing like cloud pillars in the sky, and we give names to alien rocks as if they were our pets. We hunger for warp space, for the outlying rim of time. And this is the species that kids itself that it likes to stay at home, to bind itself with, what are they called again, ties. That's my view. You don't have to buy it. Maybe there aren't so many of us after all. Maybe we are disruptive and antisocial and we shouldn't be allowed. You're entitled to your opinion. All I will say is, sleep soundly, sleep tight, and sweet dreams. The point about that passage, I think, is to, in this context, is that to persecute groups like the Roma is to persecute our own secret selves. To criminalize an entire ethnic group is to vandalize our own secret identities. We are all travelers in our dreams. We are all outlaws, adventurers, outcasts. In our hearts, we know that we are all misunderstood. How easy, then, to turn against the weakest in our midst and blame them for all our ills. The Roma are in danger of becoming the scapegoats for our fears. The real crime is ours, the crime of turning their life into a waking nightmare. Thank you.